The Nigerian economy is currently going through a precarious situation at the moment, as the fragile economy is yet to fully recover from COVID-19 induced recession, which by extension has affected government's revenues. According to the National Bureau of Statistics, in its most recent published report covering internally generated revenue at state level for the fourth quarter and full year 2020, shows that in the fourth quarter of the year, states and FCT figures hit 335.25 billion naira compared to 338.57 billion naira recorded in quarter 3 of 2020. This indicates a negative growth of 0.98% on the quarter-and-quarter basis. The 36 states and FCT IGR figure hits 1.31 trillion naira in 2020 compared to 1.33 trillion naira recorded in 2019, which also indicates a negative growth of 1.93% year-on-year. Barely 24 hours before the NBS report was released, some state governments have started talking or taking what will be described as drastic measures, such as downsizing of their workforce, slashing workers' salaries, as well as reverts to the 18,000 naira minimum wage as cost-cutting strategies to manage their lean revenues. While Lagos and Rivers State recorded the highest internally generated revenue with 418.99 billion naira and 117.19 billion naira respectively. The question begging for answer is that what other state governments or what are other state governments doing to increase their IGR at a time when revenues from the Federation Account Allocation Committee, it seems to also be dwindling. Well, joining me live via Skype to provide answers to some of these questions and, of course, others, he is the Chief Executive Officer of Cowrie Assets Management Limited, Mr. Johnson Chukwu. Mr. Chukwu, good afternoon to you, sir.
Good afternoon to you.
Well, it's great to have you join us on the show. Now, I'm sure you saw that figure. Very sure you've seen it. And I'll first of all want to ask you, were you expecting that decline? Now you've seen the decline. Was that the rate you were seeing it? How do you see states faring moving forward?
I wouldn't say a decline was a surprise to me because you all recognize the fact that 2020 was a challenging year economically. We saw a lockdown in virtually all the countries of the world, and Nigeria was not an exception. So the figures for IGR for 2020 compared to 2021, compared to 2019, which was a marginal decline of just about 1%, for me was not a surprising thing. But the interesting thing is to disaggregate the figures and look at what the states or which of these states did. And that's, for me, is where the crux of the matter. That's what should be the talking point. The marginal decline we saw in the fourth quarter, as well the marginal decline we saw, the decline in the fourth quarter was less than 1%, and the decline in the year was just about 1.09%. So those, for me, are not the concerns, because we all know that 2020 was a challenging year for everybody, and the economies were locked down. But the conversation, like I said, should focus on what are each of the states doing. You did mention earlier that Lagos State has the highest IGR. Lagos State's IGR accounts for more than 78% of its total revenue. And compare that to the state likes of Yobe State or the likes of Borno State and some of these states that are giving you, that have internally generated revenue to total revenue of barely 10% or less than 10%. So that means that this could actually be a measure of which states are economically viable and which states are not economically viable.
Yes, states that are economically viable and those that are not economically viable. Now, like you alluded to, Lagos State doing very well, but we also saw states like Kebbi, Ebonyi also boosting revenue about over 80%, something around that. What is also happening in states like that?
Well, what I would say is that also recognize that some of these payments are seasonal, yes. And they're also a timing issue. So to actually appreciate who is doing well, you may need to look at the trend over the past four quarters, or look at the trend over the years. There are a few states that actually saw an increase in their IGR in the month of in the last quarter, which includes states like Kaduna State. You did mention Ebonyi State. I also observed a state like Anambra State had an increase, and Kebbi State had an increase in their Q4 of fourth quarter IGR. But this could be as a result of timing differences. It could be instances where companies are remitting their payee towards the end of the year, so they remitted in the last quarter of the year, or some other land use charge and some of those fees and charges were paid by companies and individuals toward the end of the fiscal year. But what matters for me is what has been the trend over time. What is the proportion of the IGR to the total revenue? Can the state survive on its IGR? Because people are pushing for federal fiscal federalism. If we talk of fiscal federalism, each state must be able to stand on its own. And if a state is living from federation allocation, then there's a problem. That means that state would not be able to stand on its own when we actually adopt the fiscal federalism, which a lot of people are agitating for, which is the direction we should move towards.
Now I'm looking at also issues around tax, which some states would like to look at. When there is no much of activities going on in a space, then you can't really tax effectively. Aside from states like Lagos that we know, we see what's playing out. Do you see tax revenue also helping the state government at this time? Then the feeding bottle style, some say going to Abuja for funding and all of that is something that should be discouraged. It's a 2-in-1 question.
What I would say is that the tax revenue is, like you rightly pointed out, is dependent on the effectiveness of the administration of that state as with respect to the kind of economic activities taking place in that state. Lagos State obviously has become what somebody called an island in the desert, or an oasis in the desert, where economic activities, everybody is migrating to engage some level of economic activity. And it wasn't an accident. This was built over time. This was as a result of concerted strategies developed and implemented by the then Bola Ahmed Tinubu government that subsequent governments in the state have adopted. And let me point to you, Tolu, that another state is actually aping what Lagos State has done very well, Kaduna State. If you look at Kaduna State's IGR, it accounts for 44.5% of the total revenue of the state. Kaduna State is in the northwest. It's bounded by Katsina State, Kano State, but look at the IGR of Katsina State and Kano State. Kaduna State made over 50.7 billion from IGR in 2020, despite the economic downturn we all witnessed. Compare that to Kano State, that's a much bigger state that made less than 30 billion from IGR. And then Katsina State, that's just its next door neighbor, that should actually have the same economic structure as Kaduna State. But because the governor of Kaduna State is effectively pushing for internally generated revenue, is trying to drive economic activity to the state. And if you look at what he did when Abuja Airport was closed down, he actually tried to immediately make sure that the Kaduna State was a replacement or standing airport for Abuja Airport. That is strategic. And somebody being able to move to Kaduna State may not be able to move back, may want to stay back there. So the key thing is that this is also a pointer. The IGR report is also a pointer to the quality of leadership at the state levels, and which state is actually driving economic expansion, economic growth, economic diversification, and attracting businesses to the state. Elsewhere in the world, where you have federal system of government, the state government go out to seek for business to site or locate in their state, and ultimately generate revenue from those businesses in form of taxes. But here, because the state governments are where they can go to the federation account and collect allocation at the end of every month, there is no concerted effort by most states to attract private sector investment in their states, which will ultimately boost their revenues.
Now that takes me to my next question, talking about going to Abuja for the allocation and all of that. We saw what played out and it's still in the news. I still had Governor of Ebonyi State, he reacted to it today on a TV program talking about printing of 50 or 60 billion to augment monies to be shared, I think, in fact. Now this has been discussed all around, generated concerns from all quarters. Some say yes, it's done in other countries. Some say it's done. We've seen stories of other countries. But I'd like you to react to this. The governor says, and the Minister of Finance is saying, no, this never happened. And the CBN governor is coming to say, the bailout funds that have even been given out before now, we want them back. So it's like, everyone is just maintaining different positions. Where do you stand with regards to this argument?
Well, it's not really where I stand because I'm not one of the contending parties. But I would say analyst. What I know. I will tell you what I know about it.
Okay.
The issue of supporting the government by ways and means have been there for quite some time. And it's a fact that the central bank has been granting accommodation to the federal government. I don't know if those accommodations are partially passed on to the state government, but in terms of granting accommodation to the federal government, that has been going on for quite some years. In 2020, the central bank funded the federal government to the tune of 3.3 trillion naira at the end of November. That is between January and November last year. The central bank granted accommodation, so they actually granted overdraft to the federal government. When you fund the federal government by ways and means, it can also be said, you can also use the word that the central bank printed money, because what they did was create credit. They created high-powered money, which is basically granting overdraft, and the federal government can draw on an account that is not funded. So that means the volume of money in circulation increased by that volume that the central bank granted to the federal government. So that's effectively amounts to printing money. So the question is not whether money has been printed. It just maybe the use of the word printing of money has been misinterpreted by the public as that naira notes and coins have been minted. It doesn't necessarily follow that. Once the central bank grants accommodation to the federal government, what the central bank has done is to print money or has created high-powered money. So that be that as it may, even in January, the fiscal report of the federal government that the central bank published a week ago stated that the central bank accommodated the federal government to the tune of 485.6 billion naira in January. So you can also say that in January, the central bank printed 485.5 billion naira in supporting the federal government. So these are facts. As it stands today, the central bank is the lender of last resort, is a banker to the federal government. So the central bank lends to the federal government. And that lending comes in form of ways and means funding. Ideally, there should be a limit to what the central bank can lend to the federal government, because such lending, if it has no limitation, could create some other unintended economic instability or economic distortions, such as increase in inflation rates, pressure on exchange rates. And what we're seeing in effect is that this has been, it's part of the roles of the federal central bank, but maybe the magnitude is what we'll be discussing. And I know that even the federal government said earlier this year, I think the Minister of Finance said that the federal government is going to issue instruments to securitize about 10 trillion naira it has borrowed from the central bank in the past 5 years. So these are facts, and I don't think there's any need for any debate around them.
Nice. Thank you very much for explaining that to us and a little bit of more clarity on that issue. Now, some say the governors need more powers, maybe to take charge for them to be able to be more productive or making their states more productive. You've talked about quality of leadership. Do you think more needs to be done to, make them, have that control so that they could, venture into some other things that could make their states more vibrant?
So the truth is that I don't think there's any logic in that argument. I did mention that Lagos State government internal generated revenue accounts about 78% of the total revenue. Kaduna State, which in the north, so if you say this has to do with Lagos, what of Kaduna State, that its internal generated revenue about 50.7 billion naira and account for the 4.5% of its total revenue. The fact is that it depends on the quality of leadership. I remember when somebody like Mr. Peter B was governor of Anambra State, I ran into a friend who was an executive director in GSK, and he told me how then Mr. Peter B, as governor of Anambra State, came to GST to come and beg them because he had rumors that they wanted to set up an operational base in the southeast of the country. And he went about begging them and persuading them. He said he offered them land, he will come and wait for them at the airport, and he was shocked that a governor could be doing that. He wooed them to come to Anambra State. Same thing he did to bring in Sab Miller, that is South African breweries, to come to Anambra State to set up operation. That's what the state government should be doing. I know today, a state like Akwa Ibom State, where I have some investment, business investment, have been effectively wooing businesses to come and set up in Akwa Ibom State, which, we must recognize that's the direction we should be talking of. They have what they call a one-stop shop for businesses. So whatever you need, they will grant you within that shop. And it's located in the office of the Secretary of Government of the Federation. They have a department that what they call that is focusing on investors, what they call investment unit or something like that, that is focusing on investors to come to the state. I believe these are things that other states should replicate. A state government should actively create an environment that should encourage private sector investment in their state. Such environment will include improving on the issue of infrastructural supply, improving on the quality, on the standard of security in that state. If you address infrastructure supply, transport infrastructure, power infrastructure, and then you create an environment that people can come and sleep with their two eyes closed, investors will come to your state, and you get and woo investors, even starting with local investors. So that is what is missing. It has nothing to do with additional powers. They all have all the powers to approach investors and say, come, I have an environment for you. I'm going to grant you this kind of concession accommodation to come and encourage you to come and set up in my state.
True. What about the big one, Mr. Chukwu? Cost of governance at this time. We know that revenues will continue to dwindle because of what is on ground. What do you think about cost of governance?
The issue of cost of governance can only be addressed when we adopt a fiscal federalism, where there's no big daddy there or big brother there, that you run out of money, you go and they grant you accommodation. Every month at the end of the month, you do nothing, and then you expect income to be earned. Let me tell you, any system that encourages people to get revenue or income that they didn't work for will encourage indolence. And that is kind of structure we have in the country. That's our fiscal framework. That's what it supports. Once you reverse that by adopting fiscal federalism, the state governments will cut down on their costs, because you cannot carry a cost you cannot cover. You can't continue to borrow indefinitely because your capacity to borrow will be limited. But if you cannot go to the federation account to get allocation, the two things you will do is to work hard to grow your internal generated revenue. The second thing you will do is to cut down on your expenditure. And then you will have more efficient government. And then you will have productive government. And the economy will begin to grow because the governors will focus on creating productive activities in their states.
Let's wrap up with states looking at where they have competitive advantages. Now I'm talking about looking inwards just to maybe generate more funds on the side. That's what I'm thinking now, Mr. Chukwu. What do you think? What can be done? Light industries like you identified in Anambra State. What do you think other states' governments should also do to take a cue from this? This is important. It could also help raise some funds.
Interestingly, we as a country, which is why we say we're a country with great potentials, we are blessed. Almost all the states have some extent showed their comparative advantage. River State, Bayelsa State can actually be strong in oil and gas. Beyond oil and gas, they can be strong in fishery. That's a form of farming. There are other solid minerals located in those states. Similar to Abia State. Abia State, I know, has limestone deposits and a couple of other deposits are still unexplored. Ebonyi has limestone deposits. In Kalago Cement is not functioning. Ebonyi State has salt deposits. So virtually all the states of the country, you know what's going on in Zamfara State because of mining of lead and all those other solid minerals. The key thing is that the state government should find a way of turning this into formal business activities and invite private sector to invest in those businesses. Even if the state don't get the royalty, because some of these solid minerals, the federal government has control over them. The payee of the workers that are busy working in those entities will come to the state naturally. There are other multiplier economic benefits. There are people who supply food items, hotels will spring up to service those who work in those places, and you have multiplicity of economic activity that spring up from siting of industries in your local state, which is what each state should do. Each state should ask itself, what do we have as common, what do we have naturally, either embedded in our soil here or growing our fertile land, and then build value chains that will exploit those resources and create additional values instead of just exporting the raw materials of crude form of those endowment that you have in your state. I think that's what we should be focusing on. But virtually every state in the country has some comparative advantage, has some resources it can exploit. It should be able to build economic activities around those resources and create wealth within their state.
Mr. Johnson Chukwu, thank you very much for your time. CEO Carry Assets Management Limited. I appreciate this.